Great. So I want to do a breakdown on Ben Shapiro's video, The War in Israel Explained. Not because I think he's a serious thinker who is worthy of talking about their ideas in a serious manner, but because, I think the unfortunate reality is the horrid views that someone, as blatantly Islamophobic and genocidal as Ben Shapiro, his views are shared by many people, especially in the U.S., European, and Israeli context. And that's a tragedy because it really is the U.S., Europe, and Israel that are condoning and committing the entirety of the violence against Palestinians. And in some way, government actions, even though we don't live in a full democracies, but they are somewhat constrained by popular sentiment. So the fact that these views are so widespread, it gives them leeway to act more and more reckless and more indifferent to the lives, the struggles, the health, the humanity of Palestinians. And we know this is true. We know there's at least some constraint because otherwise, why would governments do propaganda if it doesn't matter what the citizens believe? So, for that reason, I wanted to jump in and break down someone as abhorrent as Ben Shapiro, who has a history of saying things like Israelis like to build, Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. This is not a difficult issue. Hashtag settlements rock. All right, so let's just jump right in there.
Issues are rarely black and white, but there are some that are. And it turns out that one of the issues that is black and white is when a terrorist group invades a sovereign country and goes to civilian villages and starts killing babies and burning entire families and raping women and dragging them back into their hellholes and continuing to rape them and holding them hostage for the cameras. It turns out that that's pretty damned black.
So first, a lot of these things that happen, but I do feel the need to just point out that a lot of the more extreme claims that have been made about what Hamas did have turned out to be unsubstantiated. Originally there was 40 babies whose heads were beheaded. This was false. There was babies burnt alive, which uh, Ben Shapiro gave proof of this with an AI generated image. Ultimately, morale from a moral standpoint, it doesn't make much of a difference. I do believe that babies were killed. These are Israeli children with Israeli names. I don't think the Israeli government would go so far as to just say that and not have death certificates to back that up. But it certainly wasn't through things like beheadings, or at least I would be very surprised, as I think a lot of people would. Again, from a moral standpoint, a baby that is beheaded, or in a house that catches on fire, or in a building that is bombed, these all carry the same weight, and it is the same. Uh, there's the same intrinsic value that is lost, regardless of the method. So that's important, but it's also important to point out that a lot of the ways that the narrative shaped is to make Hamas and by extension all Palestinians seem as brutal as possible. Um, so it just it's something worth pointing out.
And white. There are a lot of people who you're seeing today trying to contextualize Hamas's activities in the Gaza Strip. There is no context. Is there anything that anyone could do to make you do these sorts of things? Would you?
On its face, it seems like a really stupid question, but thinking, I actually do think it is worth considering. The violence that we saw, most people aren't violent. Most people haven't gone to war. Most people haven't escaped a concentration camp and shot up who they think of as oppressors. Most people haven't done these acts. So, what would it take, truly? Because I do think it's a fair question. I think people need to truly think about that. Imagine you are a citizen of Gaza. Imagine you're 18 to 20 years old. Imagine you've lived your entire life in an open air prison concentration camp in which you cannot leave, in which you probably don't have a job, in which the majority of the water is undrinkable, but you've seen videos of Israelis pouring cement into some of the few good wells in Palestine. Imagine you're food insecure. Imagine that when you do have electricity, so not at the moment when Israel has decided to use collective punishment and turned off electricity for all Palestinians in Gaza, but when you did, it was only for a few hours every single day. Imagine you've seen peaceful movements to end this apartheid. You probably even participated in them. And you've seen marches to the edge of your border that keeps you segregated in your open air prison, and you've seen people been sniped. You've seen pregnant women been sniped. You've seen grandmothers and children been shot. You've heard some of the videos, and you've seen Israeli snipers laughing as they shoot another kneecap. You see people wearing press badges killed. You see people in nurse uniforms being shot and killed. And you give up entirely on the idea that there is a peaceful way to end this from your side. There is a peaceful way to end this conflict, but that's only if Israel chooses it. But there is no way that Palestinians can force a peaceful de escalation and end to this apartheid. So at that point, honestly ask yourself, would you commit to violence? It's a true question. This is not an excuse. And Ben Shapiro is trying to say all context in this case is evil to make terrorists humanize, which we shouldn't do. But it is a serious question. You should think about it. Given that context, given growing up in those situations, would you not? It doesn't truly matter. Maybe you say, you know what, even then, I never would, which I don't think is a fair. Um, I don't think that's necessarily a fair conclusion because thankfully, thank God, the vast majority of humans don't know. That's the honest answer is you don't know because you never grew up in a situation like that. But even if you think 100% you would never, you have to realize that at least a semi-significant portion of the population would. So when you're talking about context and you're talking about how this is a failure of Israeli policies to keep Palestinians in this apartheid state, that's what it means. It means when you treat people as subhuman pieces of garbage, some percent are going to do bad things. This is just human nature, right? Because what's the other option? If it's not the context, if it's not the settings, if it's not their surroundings that's forming them and pushing them to this violence, what is the only other alternative? The only other alternative, and this is what Ben Shapiro believes, is that Arabs are intrinsically just violent, bad human beings, right? If it's not the context, then what is it? It's intrinsic. So, he would never phrase it that way, but that's what he's hinting at. But let's continue.
For any reason at all, go and kill a baby. Would you? I have a hard time believing that you would. You know why? Because you don't think like Hamas thinks. Hamas thinks differently. They say it openly. They've been saying openly for decades that they love death more than you love life. That this is literally the stuff that they say. They've been saying since their inception they want to kill every Jew on the planet, not just in Israel, but on the planet. That they are not looking for any sort of territorial solution. In fact, people should know the Gaza Strip was abandoned by Israel in 2005.
Okay, a couple things. One, you know, maybe certain members of Hamas have said things like that and are not looking for territorial solutions, but that's certainly not all members. And even if it is, if every member of Hamas doesn't care about that, the majority of Palestinians do. It's so insane to think that everyone who is Palestinian is just bloodthirsty. They just want to kill all the Jews, all the Israelis. This is so dehumanizing, and the amount of propaganda you have to ingest and just not think critically about to truly believe we're all people. But this is the same rhetoric that happened in the South in the U.S. Uh, by slaveholders for why they can't free their slaves was because the slaves will just kill us all. They outnumber us if we make them equal. The same thing happened in South Africa. We can't allow black people to have the same rights because they'll kill us or they'll take all the power or they'll do what we did to them back to us. This isn't borne out by history. That's not what happens. But this is the belief, and this is the insane conspiracy theories that he's presenting. Oh, and then he's talking about how Israel isn't even occupying Gaza. But he's making it sound like that's because Israel is this benevolent dictatorship that's just looking out for the Palestinians. They even told their own Israelis, hey, you have to leave this area. This is so revisionist. Uh, what really happened is it was too much trouble. There's about 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. They couldn't have a few thousand Israelis in there because then they can't secure the border in the same way. Right? If you want to have an open air prison, you have to make sure people cannot go in and out easily. And if they do, it's through a very, very narrow checkpoint. You can't. They didn't want to subjugate other Israelis to having to go through that, which is why they said, "No, Israelis, you have to leave this area. We have to turn it into an open air prison." So it's not out of the goodness of the Israeli government's heart. This is absurd.
Thousands of Jews were removed from their homes in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Their houses were abandoned, their greenhouses were abandoned and turned over to the Palestinians, who promptly burned all of it and elected Hamas. Ever since then, year after year, Hamas has been using the Gaza Strip as a base for terror activities. Material that has been shipped into the Gaza Strip for humanitarian purposes has been repurposed by Hamas for military means. Cement shipped in for buildings has been used to build terror tunnels. Pipes shipped in to build sewage systems has been repurposed to make rocket tubes. This is what Hamas is. This is what Hamas does. And it is evil. It is evil. And anybody who attempts to contextualize or justify this
Hold on. So people building weapons for self-defense, which is truly how they see it. They do see it, right? This is their land that they are being imprisoned in. So attacking the occupier is an act of self-defense. But using the materials you have is somehow different than using what? I don't understand. Just because it's low tech? What is the point here? Whatever.
is making an ass of themselves. And the history just doesn't support any of the quote unquote decolonization narrative that you are currently hearing. The areas
Sorry, it's late when I'm recording this, but I think I realize this point, which is that this was somehow the reason that Palestinians were living in these horrible situations. It's because Hamas was taking all the resources that they had to build weapons. This is insane. This is insane. This is insane. The water is off right now, not because Hamas took all the pipes, but because the Israeli government said we're turning off the fucking water.
that were attacked here have been part of Israel since 1947, since inception. The Gaza Strip has been in the control of Palestinians entirely since 2005.
In what way has it been in their control? If they can't say we're going to leave, we're going to trade, we're going to build our own infrastructure, then it's not in their control. He just means it's populated by. These are entirely separate things. It's uncomfortable to use Nazi references or similarities, but this is like saying Auschwitz was Jewish controlled because it was all Jewish people in it. This is absurd. This is absurd.
There is no context that can be provided for the burning of families and the rape of women and the parading of them through the streets. What context, if there is a lack of moral clarity here, it is because of one of two things. One, ignorance and narcissism. You believe that Hamas thinks like you think, and therefore you believe that no one would do anything like this unless some terrible wrong had befallen them. Except you're not using your head, because here's the reality. You wouldn't do this even if a terrible wrong befell you. Or possibility number two, you just don't care. You don't care because it's Jews involved. Jew hatred would be the other possibility, and there's a lot of that going around. The left is replete with it these days. You're seeing statements from Students for Justice in Palestine in the United States calling for solidarity with the people who just murdered 1,200 Jews in the worst single event for Jews since the Holocaust. You are seeing unions of workers who are coming out in favor of Hamas.
The idea that all of the support, or even a significant minority of the support, is based in anti Semitism is absurd. But people that look at this objectively see there are two groups. One has all the power, one has the military, has the strongest military in the Middle East and is backed by the strongest military in the world. and is committing crimes on a purely numerical basis, 10x, 100x, 200x, that the other side is. So, of course, they're in solidarity with the people living in open air prisons. This has nothing to do with anti Semitism. The religious background makes no difference here. Sure, I'm sure there's some crackpot anti Semites who happen to be part of it, but this is a insignificant, especially in the U.S. Especially in the U.S. context, so much of the pro-Palestinian movement historically and currently has been forefronted, and some of the most moving speakers are Jewish. And even in Israel, I think there's an uncomfortable amount of Israelis that have totally dehumanized Palestinians, but there are a significant portion of Israelis that don't, that see the crime for what it is and are fighting against that and will continue fighting against it. So trying to say that caring about the plight of the Palestinian people is somehow anti Semitism is just absurd.
You're seeing crowds in Sydney, Australia, chanting "Gas the Jews." You're watching crowds in London chanting on behalf of Hamas. You're seeing crowds in Dearborn, Michigan, chanting on behalf of Hamas. You're seeing sitting Congress.
So again, there are some examples for sure. Any chant that is chanting "gas to Jews" is, of course, it is abhorrent. The whole point of the vast majority of people that have Palestinian solidarity is that all lives intrinsically matter the same. And we can't just care about one side. But that does not dehumanize, it does not devalue Jewish Israeli lives. Of course not. This is absurd.
People refusing to condemn the murderous Hamas activities when asked multiple times to do so. That is what you're watching. That is, if you lack moral clarity,
Um, which Congress people did not do that? Because I'm guessing he's referring to the squad, but that's just false. I'm not going to look at all the squad members' statements, but here's AOC's. From 6 days ago, I condemn Hamas's attack in the strongest possible terms. There. No child or family should ever endure this kind of violence and fear, and this violence will not solve the ongoing oppression and occupation in the region. Apologies. An immediate ceasefire and de-escalation is urgently needed to save lives. So, where is what he's talking about? Where are the Congress people refusing to condemn? There are some people that refuse to condemn, and I think their voices are worth listening to consider. Here's one, Norman Finkelstein. He is a professor. He spent 40 years talking about what's happening in Palestine. He is Jewish. Both of his parents are Holocaust survivors. So, if someone has the right to have these opinions, it's certainly someone like Norm.
Is it really a shock that a couple of days ago, the people of Gaza, most of whom, let's bear it in mind, most of whom were born in that concentration camp. Mm-hmm. They were born into it. Does it really shock you that they would do something desperate to break free of that concentration camp? Mm. And who dare criticize whatever tactics they employed? I am not approving it, but I am not disapproving it, because I don't know what I would do if I had been born into a concentration camp and spent 20 years of my life there.
And what's so ironic about what Ben Shapiro is saying about how you're a good person, you would never do this. The whole point of this video, the whole point of all the videos he's been putting out about this, is to justify Israelis indiscriminate killing of Palestinians. So the reality of the situation is that type of logic is the exact same type of logic that Hamas is using. He is exactly the type of person that would do those indiscriminate killings, and we know that because he's using this as a justification for indiscriminate killings. All right, but let's continue.
Clarity about that. That is not because you are sophisticated. It is not because you see shades of gray. It's not because you're so complex. It's because you're a fool. Again, there are certain times in life when there is a right and there is a wrong, and this is that time. Now, Israeli society is coming together in ways that it has not come together probably in Israel's history. Israeli society is incredibly resilient. They've been under terror assault literally since the day that the state of Israel was born and long before. There have been riots against Jews in Israel for as long as there's been a Zionist movement in Israel and long before that. With that said, does Israel require moral support? Of course. Of course, Israel requires moral support. Israel is facing down not only a military threat on its southern border, but also a military threat on its northern border. Iran is threatening action. Syria,
Hold on, I'm sorry.
southern border. Iran is, of course. Of course, Israel requires moral support. Israel is facing down not only a military threat on its southern border, but also a military threat on its northern border. Iran is threatening action. Syria is threatening action. The American people, we ought to at the very least say that Israel is in the right. Rearm Israel in order so that Israel can kill terrorists, who, by the way, hate Americans just as much as they hate Jews. Preventing a broader regional war from breaking out is in America's interest. It is. And so, again, for all the folks on the left who openly sympathize with Hamas, and for some of the folks on the right who are playing a peculiarly morally ambiguous game, where it's too hard to know what's going on. No, it isn't. You're either an anti Semite or you're a useful idiot. Those are the choices that are before you. So maybe you ought to wake up and smell the coffee as to what these evil human beings are actually attempting to do. Folks, issues are rarely black and white.
Okay, so I don't know. I don't know what else there is to say. You know, clearly, this is again just used as justification, or like he said, kill Hamas. What he's leaving out is that Hamas is in Gaza, which is one of the most highly concentrated and dense cities in the world, regions in the world. There's 2 million people into a relatively small area. And the way that Israeli government is going about killing Hamas is indiscriminately bombing. They've flattened entire neighborhoods. Um, they sent white phosphorus to a children's hospital, bombed it with white phosphorus. You know, I've seen so many heartbreaking videos of parents in Palestine carrying their dead children. The idea that this is, you wouldn't even describe it as retribution, it's just national security, which is absurd. I mean, take just think for 1 second how obvious it has to be that these attacks are at least semi or mostly random. If the Israeli government, which supposedly has one of the best intelligence agencies in the world, but if they didn't see these attacks coming, and we know they didn't because they had no troops near Gaza, all of them were in the West Bank protecting occupiers stealing Palestinian land. But if they had no idea that Hamas was building up to the biggest act of violence in its history, then how the hell are you supposed to believe that now they know where they are? Their intelligence is clearly not in the loop. So this is just absurd. So the only way that they could kill Hamas is just by killing huge populations of Palestinians. So, yeah, again, this is just genocidal propaganda that's made to make people feel that when they see bombs and entire neighborhoods um, destroyed, when they see people fleeing after Israeli told them to flee, and then those buses full of freeing fleeing civilians bombed. This is somehow justified. Um, there's 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 no excuse. You can't even get close to an excuse for this type of propaganda. It's disheartening, to say the very very least. But okay, I've now covered Ben Shapiro, who I knew was going to have genocidal takes. I covered Sam Harris, who presented it in a much more reasonable way, but had very similar genocidal takes. I would love suggestions for who to cover next. I don't see this dying down anytime soon, because the Israeli government doesn't seem to want to allow this to simmer down. It seems like there is a real want for retribution. Um, I'm definitely going to continue covering best I can. So please, if there's any narratives that you think I've heard this time and time again, let me know so I can dig in.